The air in the emergency room of Metropolitan General was a familiar, chaotic symphony. It was a composition of rhythmic beeps from cardiac monitors, the hiss of oxygen masks, the squeak of rubber soles on polished linoleum, and the low, pained moans of the afflicted. To Nurse Elara Vance, this cacophony was a kind of baseline, a sound she could filter and parse with the same unconscious ease that a submarine sonar operator isolates the signature of a distant propeller. She moved through the chaos, not like a participant, but like a ghost, a silent, efficient presence whose hands were always exactly where they needed to be. Her face, framed by dark hair pulled back into a severe, functional bun, was a mask of placid professionalism, her blue eyes scanning vitals, reading charts, and assessing patients with a calm that bordered on unnerving. She was, by all accounts, an exemplary nurse. Her IV insertions were flawless, her dosage calculations instantaneous, and her bedside manner, while not warm, was profoundly reassuring in its competence. Patients felt safe under her care, not because she offered comforting platitudes, but because her every action radiated an aura of absolute control in a world that had just spun violently out of it. Yet, there was a distance to her, a quiet reserve that her colleagues mistook for shyness or even a lack of ambition. They saw the faint, silvery web of scars that cross-hatched her forearms, visible when she pushed up her sleeves to scrub in, and they accepted her clipped explanation of a bad cooking accident with hot oil years ago. They saw a woman who was good at her job, but ultimately just a nurse. They never noticed the economy of her movements, the way she never took a single wasted step, or how her body was always perfectly balanced, centered, ready. They never saw the predator's stillness that she wore like a hospital gown. A multi-car pileup on the interstate had flooded the ER, and Elara was the calm eye of the storm. She was triaging with a speed and accuracy that left the residents breathless. A fractured femur here, a suspected pneumothorax there, a simple laceration to be sutured later. Her gaze swept over the groaning, bleeding tide of humanity, her mind a rapid-fire processor of injury, urgency, and resource allocation. It was then that the paramedics wheeled in two new arrivals simultaneously. One was a man in a bespoke suit, screaming about the scratch on his vintage sports car and the throbbing in his wrist. His wife fluttering beside him, already on the phone with their lawyer. The other was a transient, a man whose clothes were rags and whose scent was a cocktail of stale liquor and street grime. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged, a deep, ugly contusion blooming over his temple. Elara's assessment took less than a second. Suit, stable, minor injury, loud, transient, unstable, potential intracranial bleed. Critical, she directed the orderly with a flick of her eyes. Bay 3 for the head trauma, get Dr. Ramirez. Page neuro. I need vitals, and prep for intubation. She turned to the man in the suit, her voice flat. Sir, please wait over there. Someone will be with you shortly. This was the moment the world tilted on its axis. The man, whose name was Alistair Finch, was a primary donor to the hospital, a fact he was not shy about. His indignation was a palpable force. But it was nothing compared to the storm that followed him into the ER, Mr. Thornton, the hospital administrator. Thornton was a man sculpted from fear and ambition. He was short, impeccably dressed, and possessed a voice that could curdle milk. He saw Alistair Finch, his golden goose, being ignored, and his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He bypassed the chaos, his expensive shoes clicking with furious purpose until he stood directly in front of Elara. Nurse, he began, his voice a low hiss that cut through the surrounding noise. What do you think you are doing? Mr. Finch is a patron of this institution. He requires immediate attention. His eyes flicked to the unconscious man being rushed into a trauma bay. That person can wait. Elara did not turn to face him fully. Her attention was on the monitor already displaying the transient's plummeting oxygen saturation. The patient in Bay 3 is critical. Mr. Finch has a possible wrist sprain. He is stable. Her reply was devoid of emotion, a simple statement of medical fact. This clinical detachment was, to Thornton, the highest form of insubordination. It was a rejection of the hospital's true hierarchy, which was measured not in degrees of medical urgency, but in the size of donations. "I am not debating medical specifics with you," he snapped, his voice rising, drawing the attention of other staff. "I am giving you a direct order. You will attend to Mr. Finch now." "This is a matter of professional priority," he gestured dismissively toward the trauma bay. "We are not a charity ward for every piece of human refuse that washes up on our doorstep. We are a business." For the first time, Elara turned her head and looked directly at him. Her blue eyes were suddenly not calm. They were arctic, chips of ice reflecting the cold, hard vacuum of deep space. For a fleeting moment, Thornton felt a primal jolt of fear, a sense of being weighed and measured by something ancient and utterly unimpressed. "My priority," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying with absolute clarity, "is saving a life. Not servicing a bank account." She then turned her back on him completely and walked into Bay 3, leaving him sputtering in her wake, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. The public humiliation was a wound he would not, and could not, forgive. The fallout was as swift as it was predictable. The next morning, Elara was summoned to Thornton's office on the top floor. The room was an exercise in corporate vanity, all dark wood, polished chrome, and a panoramic window that offered a God's eye view of the city below. Thornton sat behind a desk the size of a small car, flanked by the head of human resources and a hospital lawyer. He let her stand. He relished the imbalance of power. He launched into a tirade disguised as a formal reprimand, his voice dripping with condescending fury. He spoke of insubordination, of poor judgment, of endangering the hospital's financial stability. He painted her as a reckless, emotionally driven subordinate who lacked the basic understanding of how the world truly worked. "Your job, nurse, is to follow the directives of your superiors," he pontificated, leaning forward, his small hands steepled. "It is not to make unilateral decisions based on some misguided, bleeding heart sense of justice. Mr. Finch is a pillar of this community. The man you so gallantly chose to prioritize is, for all intents and purposes, a statistical drain on society. Your actions were not just unprofessional, they were fiscally irresponsible." Elara stood perfectly still, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. Her expression was unreadable. She listened to his monologue without interruption, her gaze fixed on a point just over his shoulder, as if studying the cloud formations outside. She offered no defense, no apology, no explanation. This silent compliance seemed to infuriate Thornton even more than an argument would have. He wanted her to beg, to plead, to show remorse. Her stoicism denied him that satisfaction. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending a full review by the board," he declared, slamming a pen down on his desk for emphasis. "And I will be recommending termination. You will be escorted from the premises. Hand over your badge and your access card." A security guard, who had been waiting meekly by the door, stepped forward. Elara unclipped her ID badge from the collar of her scrubs. The plastic card, bearing her picture and the title Registered Nurse, felt flimsy, insignificant. She placed it on the polished surface of Thornton's desk. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She simply turned and walked toward the door, the guard falling into step behind her. Her professional world was collapsing, and she met it with the same quiet indifference she met the daily chaos of the ER. The walk out of the hospital was a strange, sterile procession. Colleagues she had worked with for years averted their eyes, pretending to be engrossed in charts or conversations. They had all heard what happened. They knew it was unjust, but Thornton's power was absolute, and fear was a more potent motivator than loyalty. Elara felt their pity and their fear like a change in atmospheric pressure. It meant nothing. She had been through purges before, in places where the consequences were not a lost job, but a shallow grave. This was just paperwork. As she pushed through the main glass doors of the atrium, the city sunlight hit her, bright and indifferent. She blinked once, her eyes adjusting. And then she saw them, parked directly in the ambulance bay, in a space reserved for the most critical emergencies, was a long, black government-issue sedan. It was flanked by 3 figures who seemed to have been carved from granite and dressed in the immaculate blue uniforms of the United States Marine Corps. 2 were captains, their posture ramrod straight. The third was a full colonel, his chest a constellation of ribbons that told a story of fire and service. They were not looking at the hospital. They were looking directly at her. Inside, Mr. Thornton had savored his victory. He had watched her silent, ignominious exit on the security monitors. He felt a surge of vindication. He had reasserted the natural order of things. He turned to his window, intending to watch her trudge away in defeat. Instead, he saw the black car and the 3 officers. He frowned. It was a breach of protocol for any vehicle to be parked there. He was about to call security when he saw the colonel step forward as Elara emerged. He watched as the highest-ranking officer executed a salute so sharp, so precise, it could have cut glass. The 2 captains followed suit in perfect, synchronized motion. Thornton's mind stuttered. Marines didn't salute nurses. Colonels did not salute anyone without a very, very good reason. He watched, his mouth slightly agape, as the colonel began to speak to Elara. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see the profound, almost reverent respect in the man's bearing. He saw Elara give a short, curt nod. He saw one of the captains open the rear door of the sedan for her. She didn't look back at the hospital, at the life she was leaving, at the career he had just destroyed. She slid into the back of the car with the quiet dignity of a monarch entering a chariot. The colonel took his seat beside her. The doors closed, and the car pulled away, its tires making no sound at all. Thornton stood frozen, a cold dread beginning to seep into the warm glow of his triumph. He had a sudden, terrible feeling that the piece of human refuse she had saved and the suspended nurse he had just humiliated were connected to a world he could not begin to comprehend. He had not fired a subordinate. He had kicked a hornet's nest the size of a mountain. The lockdown alarm was a shrill, piercing scream that shattered the hospital's midday lull. It was a sound no one ever wanted to hear, the digital shriek of a system tipping from emergency into catastrophe. Red lights flashed in stark, rhythmic pulses, painting the beige walls in strokes of pure panic. Doors sealed with the heavy thud of magnetic locks. In the main lobby, the idyllic scene of waiting families and discharged patients had devolved into chaos. 4 men, dressed in black tactical gear, had moved with a brutal, synchronized efficiency that spoke not of random violence, but of professional execution. They were armed with short-barreled rifles, their faces obscured by balaclavas. Their leader, a tall man with cold, intelligent eyes visible through the slit in his mask, directed the operation with hand signals. He was Silas. His voice, when he used it, was a low, calm rasp over their private comms. Package is on the 3rd floor, surgical wing. Secure the ground floor, cut communications. No civilian casualties unless necessary. This is a surgical extraction, not a massacre. Keep it clean. His men fanned out, their movements fluid and practiced. One shot out the main communication panel with a suppressed pistol. Another herded the screaming civilians into a corner. A third disabled the security desk guard with a swift, disabling blow to the back of the neck. On the 3rd floor, Captain Eva Rostova of the Diplomatic Security Service felt the tremor of the initial assault. She was posted outside the door of a private recovery suite where a visiting trade minister from a small but geopolitically critical nation was recovering from a minor, clandestine outpatient procedure. Her hand instinctively went to the SIG Sauer holstered at her hip. The lockdown alarm confirmed her worst fears. She keyed her own radio. "Consulate, this is Guardian. We have a code black at the designated medical facility. I repeat, code black." Before she could say more, 2 of Silas's men rounded the corner. They didn't hesitate. They opened fire. Rostova was good. She returned fire, taking cover behind a steel gurney. The air filled with the deafening crack of gunfire and the smell of cordite. She felt a searing, white-hot pain rip through her left shoulder, spinning her around. Another round tore through her thigh, and she went down hard, her leg buckling beneath her. Her vision swam. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed the edges of her sight was the black boots of the mercenaries kicking open the door to the minister's room. Down in the ER, the lockdown had trapped a pocket of terrified staff and patients. Among them was Elara Vance. Her escort, the now trembling security guard, had fumbled with his keys at the exit, and the magnetic locks had sealed them in before he could get the door open. Also trapped was Mr. Thornton, who had been on his way down to gloat to the ER staff about his decisive action. He was now huddled behind a reception desk, his face pale and sweating, muttering about lawsuits and security failures. Elara was not huddled. She stood near the center of the room, perfectly still, listening. The initial burst of gunfire from the lobby had been suppressed, 9 memory by the sound of it. The second, more distant exchange from upstairs was unsuppressed, a mix of 5.56 mm carbines and a different caliber pistol, likely a .40 S&W. She processed the acoustics, the cadence of the shots, the duration of the exchange. It was a professional team. Coordinated, well-armed. This wasn't a lone gunman. This was an infiltration. Her eyes scanned the ER. She noted the exits, the cover points, the potential improvised weapons. A fire extinguisher. A heavy oxygen tank on a rolling stand. A crash cart laden with metal instruments. Her brain, the part she had kept dormant and sedated for 3 years under the gentle routine of nursing, was waking up. It was a cold, logical engine of violence and survival, and it was coming online with terrifying speed. The mask of the quiet, unassuming nurse was beginning to crack. 2 of Silas's men, tasked with clearing the lower floors, burst into the ER through the ambulance bay doors. On the ground. Everyone on the ground, now. One of them yelled, his rifle sweeping the room. The remaining staff and patients complied instantly, whimpering, dropping to the linoleum. Thornton practically dissolved into a puddle behind the desk. Everyone except Elara. She remained standing, her hands held slightly out from her sides in a gesture of non-aggression. But her stance was wrong. Her weight was perfectly distributed. Her eyes were not wide with fear, but narrowed in assessment, tracking the muzzle of the lead mercenary's rifle, noting his grip, his posture, the way he scanned the room. The mercenary's eyes locked onto her. I said, on the ground. He barked, taking a step toward her. His partner was focused on the other side of the room. His attention divided. It was a fatal mistake. The mask didn't just crack, it shattered. Elara's entire demeanor shifted in a microsecond. The placid nurse vanished, replaced by something honed and lethal. Her movement was a blur, an explosion of kinetic energy that the mercenary's brain couldn't even process. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, she closed the distance. Her left hand shot out, not to block the rifle, but to grip the barrel and redirect it towards the ceiling. Simultaneously, her right hand, which had snatched a stainless steel scalpel from a nearby tray, moved in a vicious, precise arc. The blade, designed for cutting flesh, was an extension of her will. It entered the soft tissue beneath the mercenary's jaw, severing the carotid artery and vagus nerve in one clean, upward thrust. His finger spasmed on the trigger, sending a burst of automatic fire harmlessly into the ceiling tiles. He made a choked, gurgling sound and collapsed, his eyes wide with shocked disbelief. The second mercenary spun around, alerted by the gunfire. He was too slow. Elara was already moving, using the falling body of his comrade as a shield. She had stripped the dead man's sidearm from its thigh holster, a Glock 19, its weight familiar and comforting in her palm. She didn't aim. She indexed. 2 rounds, fired in a rapid, controlled pair, a double tap, struck the second mercenary in the center of his chest, punching through his tactical vest with the sheer kinetic force of the close-range shots. He was thrown backward, his rifle clattering to the floor, his body slumping against a wall before sliding down to a sitting position, dead before he hit the ground. Silence descended, thick and absolute, broken only by the lingering hum of the hospital's machinery and the ragged, terrified gasps of the onlookers. Elara stood over the 2 bodies, the smoking pistol in one hand, the blood-slick scalpel in the other. Her chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths. Her face was a blank slate of lethal calm. She looked at the blood on her hands, then at the horrified faces of her colleagues, and felt nothing but the cold, clear focus of the mission. The hospital was compromised. There were hostiles. There was a threat to be neutralized. Mr. Thornton peered over the edge of the desk, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it had silenced him. He saw the 2 dead men in their tactical gear. He saw Elara, the nurse he had just publicly humiliated and fired, standing between them like an avenging angel, armed and bloodied. The world had ceased to make any sense. His mind, built on a foundation of spreadsheets and social hierarchies, could not compute what it was seeing. This quiet, mousy woman had just dispatched 2 heavily armed commandos with a level of efficiency that defied belief. From the corner of the room, a groan of pain drew Elara's attention. A security guard, the one who had survived the initial lobby assault and been herded in with the others, was trying to sit up. He was bleeding from a head wound. But his eyes were on Elara, filled not with fear, but with a dawning, incredulous awe. He was a former cop. He knew what he had just witnessed. It wasn't a lucky fluke. It was tradecraft. Elite, brutal, and perfect. Elara's voice cut through the stunned silence. It was not the soft-spoken tone of Nurse Vance. It was clipped, authoritative, and resonant with command. "You," she said, pointing the Glock at the former cop. "Can you fight?" The man nodded, wincing. "Good, get his rifle. Find cover by the main corridor. You are on overwatch. Shoot anything in black tactical gear that isn't me. Do not fire unless you have a clear shot." She turned to another nurse, a young woman named Chloe who was frozen in shock. "Chloe, stop crying. Get the crash cart. We have wound it upstairs." "Thornton," her voice was laced with ice, "stay out of my way." She moved to the dead mercenaries, expertly stripping them of their radios, spare magazines, and a single flashbang grenade. She checked the rifle the guard was taking, an HK-416. "Good weapon." She handed him 2 spare magazines. "Conserve your ammunition. Fire in controlled bursts." She paused, listening to the chatter on the mercenary comms she'd acquired. They knew they had lost 2 men. They were angry. They were coming. Silas's voice, cold and controlled, came over the radio. "All teams, ground floor is hostile. I want a sweep. Find who did this. And find them now." Elara looked at the terrified faces around her. They were her responsibility now. The mission parameters had been set. Secure the asset. Neutralize the threat. Survive. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a battlefield. And she was back on the job. The 3rd floor had become a fortress. Silas had barricaded the surgical wing, using gurneys and heavy medical equipment to block the corridors. He had his prize, the trade minister, now bound and gagged in his recovery bed. But the extraction was compromised. 2 of his men were dead, and an unknown hostile was active on the ground floor. The clean, surgical operation had turned messy, and Silas hated messy. He stood over the still unconscious form of Captain Rostova, whom his men had dragged into the room. He studied her wounds with a professional eye, a through and through in the shoulder, a deep graze on the thigh. She'd live. For now. "Who is she?" he asked one of his men. "Looks like diplomatic security. The minister's bodyguard. Just one?" Silas mused, his cold eyes scanning the corridor outside. Sloppy, but she wasn't the one who took out Echo Team. The resistance came from downstairs. From the ER. He keyed his radio. "Bravo Team, what's your status? I want eyes on the ER." The reply was laced with tension. "Sir, we have a barricade at the ER entrance. One hostile, armed with one of ours. Firing discipline is professional. We can't get a clean line of sight." Silas processed this. A single, professional-grade hostile in an emergency room? A cop? A security guard with more training than usual? It didn't add up. The response was too fast, too lethal. He walked to the window and looked down. The hospital grounds were swarming with local police, setting up a perimeter. They were useless, ants scurrying around a problem they couldn't solve. But then he saw something else. 3 blocks away, a convoy of black SUVs was moving at speed, weaving through traffic with an impunity that local law enforcement did not possess. Federal agents. Or something more. The timeline was collapsing. Downstairs, Elara had turned the ER into a kill box. She had her small, terrified team working with a newfound purpose, galvanized by the sheer force of her will. They moved patients to the most secure interior rooms. The former cop, whose name was Dave, was positioned perfectly, his rifle covering the main approach. Elara herself was a ghost, moving between points of cover, using the reflections in darkened monitor screens and glass panels to track the mercenaries' attempts to flank them. She was listening to their comms, anticipating their every move. She knew they would use the flashbang soon, an attempt to breach the main entrance. She pulled the pin from the one she had taken and held the spoon down. She waited, her internal clock counting down the seconds. She heard the faint clink of metal on tile in the corridor outside. The enemy's flashbang. As it detonated with a blinding flash and deafening roar, she was already moving. Before the disoriented mercenaries could rush in, she tossed her own grenade out into the corridor. It went off at their feet. Screams of pain and confusion echoed down the hall. "Now, Dave," she yelled. Dave opened fire, a controlled burst that cut through the smoke and haze, finding its targets. 2 more mercenaries went down. The assault was broken. But Elara knew it was a temporary victory. The leader, the calm voice on the radio, was smart. He would adapt. He would likely try to create a new problem, a new front. Hostages, suddenly, a new voice crackled over the mercenary radio. It was Silas, but his tone had changed. It was laced with a chilling amusement. To the mysterious ghost in the ER, "You're good. I'll give you that. But you're in a hospital, a place full of soft, vulnerable people." There was a pause, then the sound of a woman crying out in fear. "I have your colleagues from the pediatrics wing. Lovely children up here, too. I'm coming down to the main lobby. You will surrender, or I will start executing them. 1 every 60 seconds. Your choice, Ghost." A cold dread, colder than any she had felt in years, washed over Elara. This was the classic, brutal calculus of asymmetric warfare. He was using her own morality, her ingrained duty to protect, as a weapon against her. She looked at Dave, whose face had gone pale. She looked at the nurses hiding in the back. She couldn't sacrifice them. She couldn't let him kill those people. She had to give herself up. Her war was over. She lowered her weapon. She took the mercenary radio. "This is the hostel. I'm coming out." Unarmed, Silas's voice was triumphant. "Wise choice. Lobby, 10 minutes. Come alone." As Elara prepared to walk out, a new sound intruded. It wasn't the sound of gunfire or sirens. It was a deep, rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the very structure of the building. The sound of heavy rotor helicopters. Not the light, nimble news choppers or police helicopters that had been circling. These were military. Ospreys or sea stallions. The sound was unmistakable. A wave of confusion, then a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, hope, passed through her. Outside, the police cordon was thrown into chaos as 2 massive CH-53 Super Stallion helicopters descended, their rotor wash tearing at trees and kicking up a storm of debris. They didn't land. They hovered, and from their bellies, teams of black-clad soldiers fast roped to the ground with terrifying speed and precision. They were not Marines in dress blues. They were JSOC operators, the elite of the elite. They established a perimeter within the police perimeter, ignoring the local commanders, their authority absolute and unspoken. From the lead helicopter, a final figure descended. He was older, wearing a crisp, decorated army uniform. General Marcus Thorne. He landed on the grass, his boots making a soft thud. He surveyed the scene, his jaw set like iron. He ignored the frantic police chief running towards him and strode directly toward the main entrance of the hospital, an aide with a powerful bullhorn at his side. Inside, Silas had dragged his hostages, including the now conscious and defiant Captain Rostova, to the main lobby. He saw the military deployment through the glass doors, and a flicker of unease touched him. This was no longer a simple extraction. This was something else entirely. He pushed one of the terrified pediatric nurses forward, placing the muzzle of his pistol to her head just as Elara walked out of the ER corridor, her hands raised. "Here's your ghost," Silas sneered, his confidence returning. "Now, you're going to get me a clear path out of here, or the nurse gets it." Before Elara could respond, a voice boomed through the atrium, amplified to an impossible volume, shattering the tense silence. It was a voice of pure, unadulterated command, a voice that had directed armies and decided the fate of nations. It was General Thorne. "Valkyrie, this is Watchtower. I say again, Valkyrie, this is Watchtower. Stand down. The package is secure. Repeat, stand down. We have the package." The name hit Silas like a physical blow. Valkyrie, it wasn't just a call sign. It was a legend. A ghost story whispered in the intelligence and special operations communities. A single operator, gender unknown, credited with some of the most audacious and impossible missions of the last decade. An operative who had supposedly gone dark, disappeared, presumed dead after a mission in the Hindu Kush went sideways. He stared at Elara, at the quiet nurse in blood-spattered scrubs, and the impossible truth crashed down on him. He wasn't fighting a cop. He was cornered by a myth. Elara closed her eyes for a single, weary moment. The call sign, the voice, the protocol. It was like a key turning in a lock deep inside her. Her secret life, the one she had tried to bury under layers of sterile gauze and quiet service, had just come roaring back. She lowered her hands. The fight was over. Her war had followed her home. The surrender was anticlimactic. Faced with the sudden appearance of a jock task force and the impossible revelation of his opponent's identity, Silas's will to fight evaporated. He and his remaining men dropped their weapons. The operators stormed the lobby, securing the hostiles and freeing the hostages with practiced, non-violent efficiency. Medics immediately tended to Captain Rostova and the other wounded. The crisis was over. General Thorne strode into the lobby, his boots clicking on the marble floor. His eyes swept over the scene, the surrendered mercenaries, the terrified but safe civilians, the bodies of the men Elara had killed. Then his gaze found her. He walked directly to her, his expression a mixture of profound relief and deep, abiding respect. In the background, Mr. Thornton, having emerged from his hiding place, watched with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Thorne stopped a foot in front of Elara. He didn't speak to her as a general to a civilian, but as a commander to his most valued soldier. "It's good to see you, Major Vance." He used her rank. Major, not nurse. The title hung in the air, electric and heavy. The remaining hospital staff, Chloe, Dave, and the others, stared, their minds reeling. Thornton, seeing his world of authority being usurped, made a fatal error. He stepped forward, puffing out his chest, a pathetic imitation of authority. "General, I am the administrator of this hospital. This woman," he pointed a trembling finger at Elara, "is a suspended employee. She is a violent, insubordinate." Thorne turned his head slowly to look at Thornton. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his contempt was enough to silence a continent. "You," he said, the word dripping with disgust, "will be silent." He turned his attention back to Elara, his voice softening. The man you saved in the ER yesterday, the transient, that was Special Agent Michael Thorne. My son. He was undercover, part of the advance team for the minister's security. He had a severe epidural hematoma. Your poor judgment saved his life. He is stable and recovering at Walter Reed. A wave of understanding and horror washed over Thornton's face. The general's son. He had demanded a nurse let the general's son die to treat a wealthy donor's sprained wrist. Thorne wasn't finished. His voice rose, now addressing not just Thornton, but everyone in the lobby, the staff, the police, the operators. It was the voice of vindication. You see this woman? You see these scars on her arms? He gently took Elara's arm, turning it so the silvery web of old wounds was visible in the light. She told you it was a cooking accident. A lie she told to have a moment's peace. These scars are from shrapnel she took during Operation Nightfall in the Karengal Valley. She used her own body to shield a wounded teammate from a mortar blast while holding off an enemy assault single-handedly for 72 hours. 72 hours. The team she saved called her Valkyrie because she descended into hell itself to carry them home. He looked directly at Thornton, his eyes blazing with a righteous fire. This woman, this just a nurse, holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 silver stars, and a Purple Heart. She has sacrificed more for her country than you can possibly comprehend. She left the service seeking quiet, seeking a way to heal people instead of hurting them. And in return, you treated her with scorn. You belittled her. You tried to break her for doing the one thing she is programmed to do: save lives. He gestured to 2 federal agents who had entered with his team. Mr. Thornton, for willful endangerment of a federal agent, obstruction of a national security operation, and a list of financial crimes my investigators have been gleefully uncovering for the past 12 hours, you are under arrest. The agent stepped forward, flanking the utterly broken administrator. They snapped handcuffs on his wrists. He didn't resist. He was a hollowed-out man. His career, his reputation, his entire world incinerated in the space of 5 minutes. Thorne turned back to Elara. The lobby was utterly silent, save for the quiet weeping of a grateful nurse. The entire hospital staff, her former colleagues, stared at Elara not as the quiet, odd woman from the ER, but as a figure of legend. The awe was palpable. It was a thick, living thing in the air. Then, one person began to clap. It was Dave, the security guard. Then Chloe joined in. Within seconds, the entire lobby erupted in thunderous, heartfelt applause. It was a wave of sound, of gratitude, of profound, dawning respect for the quiet hero who had walked among them, unseen. Elara looked uncomfortable with the acclaim. She had never sought glory, only purpose. Thorne seemed to understand. He took off his own formal uniform jacket, the one with the general's stars on the shoulders, and gently draped it over her blood-spattered scrubs. It was a gesture of supreme honor, covering the warrior in the colors of the nation she had served so faithfully. "It's over, Major," he said softly, his voice for her alone. "Time to come home." He placed a hand on her back and guided her toward the main entrance, toward the waiting helicopters and the world she had left behind. She walked with him, her steps steady, her back straight. She did not look back at the hospital, at the life of quiet anonymity she had tried to build. That life was gone. The wolf, once hidden, was now revealed, and there was no returning to the sheep's fold. As she stepped out into the sunlight, she saw a gurney being loaded onto one of the helicopters. On it was Captain Rostova, The injured DSS agent was pale, but alert. As Elara passed, Rostova lifted her good arm and gave a slow, deliberate salute. It was a sign of respect from one warrior to another, an acknowledgement of skill, sacrifice, and a shared, unspoken code. Elara gave a short, almost imperceptible nod in return. It was all that was needed. She boarded the helicopter, the great blades beginning to spin faster, creating a deafening roar that drowned out the world she was leaving behind. The applause, the hospital, the ghost of Nurse Vance, it was all swept away in the powerful cleansing wind of the rotors as the machine lifted into the sky, carrying the hero away from the ordinary world that had never truly known her. The story of the quiet nurse was over. The legend of Valkyrie had begun anew.